Chapter 5. Beyond the IDW. The answer to the IDW and the New Right in general is an internationalist socialist synthesis that is all about global and materialist politics. The alienated and confused young men who flock to someone like Jordan Peterson obviously won't be won over to the left by telling them constantly to acknowledge and question their privilege. Nor can the even greater mass of people who aren't as plugged into politics or the culture war as IDW fans be tempted into greater engagement through a politics that centres moralism and the policing of every petty interaction. We need a material analysis buttressed with a sense of humour and a recognition of human fallibility that connects the fight for a better world to the immediate interests of the majority of the population. The point of such an analysis isn't to tell people not to worry about the sort of spiritual and existential concerns that drive young men into the arms of Peterson. On the contrary, the impulse behind left-wing politics is the desire to create a world in which our lives aren't dominated by economic concerns, where people have the free time and energy to explore, to meditate, to read novels, or to try their hand at writing them, and to pursue meaningful relationships because they're free from the workplace tyranny that leaves them too exhausted at the end of every day to do anything but watch Netflix, mindlessly skim through their social media feeds or, God forbid, game. And that, for many, is the best case scenario. The central contradiction in Peterson's message is that he both uncritically celebrates capitalist free markets and sounds the alarm at the destructive toll those markets inevitably take on relationships and communities. Our message, however, must reject Peterson's traditionalist and pseudo-libertarian worldview in favour of a vision in which everyone has the economic freedom, as in freedom from economics, to pursue their own preferred vision of the good life. Want to have a traditional family and take your 7 kids to a traditional church? Go for it. Want to live in a trisexual compound and practice Wiccanism? Do that. Where Peterson wants to enforce monogamy, socialists like me want to give everyone the freedom to make more meaningful choices in their lives by creating a world in which financial stress doesn't make it difficult to maintain relationships. People who want to start families can, and we aren't all too overworked, overstressed, and socially atomized to go out and meet people in the first place, or too afraid of indigency that we stay in toxic relationships. Even in the most tyrannical institution of capitalist societies, namely the workplace, social democratic reforms expand the sphere of human freedom. Think about the way that many people are so afraid of losing their family's health insurance that they do whatever they can to please their bosses, whether this means working overtime without pay or suffering workplace harassment. Something as simple as Medicare for All, which has been on the books for decades in Canada, where it's so popular that even conservative politicians have to at least pretend to support it, can do a lot to alleviate this unfreedom. Similar considerations apply to programs ranging from tuition-free public college to state-sponsored childcare schemes to reducing the workweek to 3 or 4 days. The recent re-emergence of social movements around the world, from Haiti to Lebanon, Chile to Sudan, and the noble effort of Jeremy Corbyn and the powerful force and potential election of Bernie Sanders to the presidency, attest to the widespread appeal of this vision. It's important to emphasise, though, that while social democracy is an immensely valuable step in the right direction, especially in a world ravaged by decades of neoliberalism and US-led militarism, for 2 reasons it ultimately won't be enough. The first reason is ideological. Why should anyone accept an economic order in which a minority of the population has the resources to own businesses and everyone else has to submit to their authority for, at least, 8 out of every 16 waking hours? Yeah, some people are upwardly mobile, but there are only so many lifeboats to save the working class. We can't all be athletes, business prodigies, or even podcasters and YouTube talk show hosts. And contrary to the delusions of the Yang Gang, the combination of robots and a universal basic income isn't going to result in any kind of desirable alternative. Even if things did play out that way, which they won't, that's just a recipe for ever greater division between rich and poor. As Ben Burgess said when we discussed Yang on TMBS, the Yang Gang's dystopia might look a lot like the Roman Empire, in which wealthy aristocrats monopolised farmable land and forced the poor to flock to Rome to live on a miserly grain ration. Or as I say, worry about capitalism, not robots. The Mondragon Corporation in Spain showcases at least some aspects of what a better alternative might look like. Another great example is Cooperation Jackson, a cooperative based in Jackson, Mississippi, which grew out of the pioneering leadership of Chokwe Lumumba and the New Africa movement. One of the latter's many victories was to elect Chokwe Lumumba and then, after his untimely death in 2014, his son Chokwe Anta Lumumba, mayor of Jackson. In the words of Malika Jabali, who discussed Cooperation Jackson with me on TMBS, Chokwe Anta Lumumba is the most progressive mayor in America. Cooperation Jackson's initiatives from the grassroots and in local government have ranged from investment in community-supported agriculture to worker-owned businesses and citizen participation in setting municipal budgets. No one knows for certain what it might look like to apply similar principles to the construction of a new national and eventually international economic order. However, a combination of nationalizations of big banks and other commanding heights of the economy and the promotion of worker-run enterprises over traditional hierarchical businesses would be key ingredients in the initial phases of any transition away from capitalism. I've been lucky enough to talk to the great Marxist economist Richard Wolff about these issues many times on TMBS, and I would strongly recommend his book, Democracy at Work, A Cure for Capitalism. When it comes to automation, the crucial issue ignored by the Yang Gang is the question of ownership. Even if all their fantasies of everything being automated come true, if the machines were privately owned, they would enrich the owners while the rest of us try to survive on the financial ration of a UBI check. In contrast, if the machines are collectively owned, then automation means we can all decide to work fewer hours so we have more time for everything that matters in life and fulfill our highest human potential. As Marx said, in an ideal world, humans would hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, rear cattle in the evening, criticize after dinner, without ever becoming a hunter, fisherman, herdsman, or critic. That's a vision worth fighting for. The second, more pragmatic reason to go beyond social democracy to more radically socialist proposals is that at a certain point we'll need to start democratizing the economy to defend the gains we've already made. As long as the capitalist class retains its economic power, owners will always try to roll back workers' advances. The history of the 20th century shows this process playing out over and over again in all areas of the world, from the global north to the global south. Thus far I've been talking mostly about economics, but there's a distinction worth making between X and Y. Some with a material politics who rightly reject the emotional toxicity and shallow analyses of the woke left have fallen into a credulous conservatism that all too often validates the woke brigade's worst suspicions and indeed bolsters genuinely bad ideas. It's entirely possible to roll your eyes at denunciations of problematic comedians and center class in your political analysis while fighting with all your heart and soul against the Trump administration putting immigrant children in concentration camps. If you find yourself reacting to both the policing of comedy and the protests against serious human rights abuses at the southern border as if they were equally unserious liberal preoccupations, you've jettisoned your sense of perspective and lost touch with important left principles, not to mention your basic humanity. What we need is a cosmopolitan socialism premised on real material needs that expresses itself in criticism, art, movement building, and anything else that drives politics. Again, following Gramsci, we need an integral approach that fuses universal desires, aspirations, and material conditions with a recognition that we do, in fact, live in a globalized, interconnected, and neoliberal world still defined by grotesque inequality, ecological crisis, and the resurgent right-wing authoritarianism. Our approach can't simply be to tell people they're wrong to be concerned with the cultural issues that define much of their lives, or to dismiss the importance of oppression that doesn't always take an economic form. Rather, we need to recapture the spirit that appealed to young Bengali Marxist M.N. Roy in 1920. Bhaskar Sankara, the founding editor of Jacobin, quotes Roy in his recent The Socialist Manifesto. To M.N. Roy, the Communist International's Second Congress was a revelation. For the first time, he remarked, brown and yellow men met with white men who were not overbearing imperialists, but friends and comrades. The point isn't to valorize the mixed record of the capital C communist movement on issues of racial and national liberation. Though communist parties have, in certain instances, contributed to racial and anti-colonial justice, especially in Cuba, Vietnam, South Africa, and the United States, in the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China, authoritarian communists suppress national, ethnic, and religious minorities in indefensible ways. Rather, the point is to highlight that the type of comradeship and solidarity across racial and national lines that Roy wrote about is going to have to be central to any kind of viable movement to achieve a better world. Indeed, it's absolutely central to the democratic and humanistic Marxism with which I identify. The need to build transracial and transnational solidarities is important for both strategic and moral reasons. When it comes to the struggle to enact even relatively modest social democratic gains in the United States, what the historian and activist Harvey Kaye calls completing the New Deal, the electoral math makes the strategic calculation straightforward. Bernie Sanders won the Michigan primary in 2016 because he won the Arab American vote in Dearborn. Going back to the 2016 general election, Hillary Clinton lost, despite winning the national popular vote, because traditional Democratic constituencies in places like Detroit, Flint, and Milwaukee weren't inspired by her message and didn't come out to vote. Granted, the people of Michigan voted for Bernie because his economic message inspired in a way Hillary's centrism never did. Unsurprisingly, Black and Arab American voters in the upper Midwest have a lot of the same bread and butter concerns as their white counterparts. The media's habit of treating those economic concerns as an exclusively white issue is maddening, given that by any measure the effects of deindustrialization have come down hardest on the Rust Belt's black population. See Maleka Jabali's work on Wisconsin in 2016. Nonetheless, it's hard not to imagine that Clinton's repellent history on issues like the mass incarceration of super predators didn't play a role in adding to the disgust and indifference that resulted in non-white voter turnout being much lower than it was in 2012, or that at least a few voters in Dearborn didn't care that Sanders was less likely than Clinton to kill their relatives in future drone strikes. In other words, the future of the US left depends on making common cause with people of all colours. This is likewise true on the international level. Global migration patterns have created surprisingly diverse populations, even in European countries that Americans often think of as exclusively white. And moreover, even in Western nations that really are monochromatic, workers' interests are inexorably tied to those of their counterparts in the global South. This is because the threat of capital flight to lower wage countries threatens social democratic advances and undermines workers' bargaining power on the shop floor. The last several decades of labour history have demonstrated that worker attempts to transcend capitalism are often blocked by anti-labour adjustments that nationalised or cooperatised industries make to compete with exploitative private firms in a global marketplace. Furthermore, there is also the fact that historically, the techniques of oppression that police and other elites use to prevent worker activism are always perfected first in the global South. Thus, when Italian unionists refused to load a Saudi ship with materials for the Emirates' genocidal campaign in Yemen, they were acting in accordance with very real strategic imperatives. Given Italy's long history of socialist and communist organising, it's possible that this was even a conscious motivation. This reminds me of a story told by the late socialist and war-resisted David McReynolds, who was for decades a member of the now-defunct Socialist Party of America. The SPA had a long and proud history dating back to Eugene V. Debs in the early 20th century. In its final decades, though, the party sometimes erred on the side of an exaggerated concern about Stalinism that led some of its leaders to downplay or ignore the far more real threat of American imperialism. This culminated in a split over the war in Vietnam, with some members supporting the intervention and some rejecting it. McReynolds, who was one of the very first people to publicly burn his draft card in 1965, was on the right side of that split, just as he landed on the right side of just about every other major debate of the late 20th century. This story takes place in 1957, 8 years before McReynolds burned his draft card. That year, the Soviet Union launched the Sputnik 1 satellite, which was the first human-made satellite to orbit Earth. McReynolds was watching coverage of the launch on a television in a bar in Greenwich Village, and in his excitement ran outside and started a conversation with the first person he saw. "We did it." "What?" "Sputnik. We put something into the sky that didn't come down." "You mean the Russians did?" "No, we. Us. The human race." Some leftists might resist the adoption of this kind of universal perspective, we us the human race, for at least two reasons. On one hand, Marxists might worry that it erases the distinction between different groups of humans with divergent economic interests. To my mind, though, this ignores the humanistic impulse that leads one to become a socialist in the first place. While it's true that struggling for a democratized economy means struggling against the segment of the population that benefits from the current undemocratic order, it's also true that, as Engels put it in the Anti-Düring, ending the division of society into contending social classes creates the possibility for a really human morality, universal in character. On the other hand, some might be anxious that, though this kind of humanism claims to be universal, people who speak in these terms often have a perspective that is painfully particularistic and, specifically, Western. As the economist Amartya Sen emphasizes, if freedom and equality and solidarity and the rest are genuinely universal human values, and like Sen I believe they are, we should be able to root them in a multiplicity of cultural traditions. The kind of global socialist internationalism I'm talking about doesn't mean that everyone has to do all of their thinking and theorizing in English, or even Esperanto. It means building a truly global intellectual and political culture with roots in a diversity of societies. Put another way, just because the messengers of universal humanism aren't necessarily who we want them to be, doesn't mean that the message itself isn't just. Sen, for instance, has noted the importance of the concept of freedom in the Buddhist tradition. In an address to the Carnegie Council, he complicated the standard issue view of Confucianism as quiescent, quoting the classical Chinese philosopher as saying that one must tell the truth even if it offends. As Sen put it, those in charge of censorship in Singapore or Beijing would take a very different view. Confucius is not averse to practical caution and tact, but does not forgo the recommendation to oppose a bad government. Shifting to India, Sen centers the role of argument in the Indian tradition. He quotes the Bengali poet Ram Mohan Ray, who wrote, "Just imagine how terrible it will be on the day you die. Others will go on speaking, but you will not be able to respond." Sen also highlights the 3rd century BC Emperor Ashoka, who promoted public ethics after being horrified by the carnage he saw in his own victorious battle against the king of Kalinga, now Orissa. In addition to converting to Buddhism and sending missionaries to promote the religion abroad, Ashoka covered the country with stone inscriptions inscribed with these and similar sayings. "A man must not do reverence to his own sect or disparage that of another man without reason. Depreciation should be for specific reason only, because the sects of all other people all deserve reverence for one reason or another. By thus acting, a man exalts his own sect, and at the same time does service to the sects of other people. By acting contrariwise, a man hurts his own sect, and does disservice to the sects of other people. For he who does reverence to his own sect while disparaging the sects of others wholly from his attachment to his own, with intent to enhance the splendour of his own sect, in reality by such conduct inflicts the severest injury on his own sect." Anyone harbouring illusions that tolerance and pluralism are uniquely and characteristically Western values might want to reflect on the fact that Ashoka commissioned that inscription centuries before his fellow emperor Caligula entertained himself and the rest of Rome by burning early Christians alive. Good and liberating ideas, like bad and reactionary ones, have thrived in a variety of cultural settings. Consider the Trinidadian Marxist C.L.R. James, who is most famous for his classic history of the Haitian Revolution, The Black Jacobins. The cover art from that book, by the way, was a pretty clear inspiration for iconography used by a magazine with a similar name founded by Bhaskar Sankara, who is himself from Trinidad. Anti-colonialism was one of James's core commitments, despite, or maybe not despite, that, as Ralph Leonard discusses in his fascinating article C.L.R. James Rejected the Posturing of Identity Politics, James was never simply anti-Western. For James, the emancipation of the black mind would come from embracing the works of dead white men such as Socrates, Sophocles, Cervantes, Shakespeare, Thackeray and Dickens, as much as the works of W.B. Du Bois, Aimé Césaire, Richard Wright, Ralph Ellison and Toni Morrison. He believed the European canon provided black people with a means of empowering themselves both culturally and intellectually, to broaden their imagination, to liberate them from the tyranny of geography and race, and to help them transcend their particularity and enter into a universal conversation across colour lines based on a shared humanity. Leonard quotes an exchange in which James was asked, should Shakespeare and Rembrandt and Beethoven matter to Caribbean people? James said he didn't like that question. He granted that if it meant that Caribbean writers should be aware that there are emphases in their writing that we owe to non-European, non-Shakespearean roots, and the past in music, which is not Beethoven, he had no objection. But in the final analysis, the Caribbean people are people. And as great artists, Shakespeare and Rembrandt and Beethoven should matter to all people, regardless of their racial, ethnic, gender, or class identity. Of course, and as Leonard observed in a conversation with me, much of the ancient Western tradition was in fact highly geographically and intellectually diverse and included African and Pan-Asian sources that are misleadingly remembered and misleadingly whitened as merely Greek or Roman. But to underline the larger point I'm trying to make, instead of policing each other's influences and enjoyments for evidence of cultural appropriation, we should all strive to emulate the curiosity and rigour of the great Christian revolutionary intellectual Cornel West, who explores the echoes between Anton Chekhov and the blues with no interest in drawing artificial lines between cultures. In making this point, I'm not claiming that there is nothing wrong with some of the things people have labelled cultural appropriation. Jay-Z was absolutely right to get what they did to the Cold Crush and to get himself on the cover of Fortune magazine. I agree with what frequent TMBS guest and crew member Brianna Joy Gray, who is now Bernie Sanders' press secretary, said in a brilliant 2017 article for Current Affairs. If the definition of appropriation had stayed narrow, it would be easy enough to defend. It's obvious it's insulting and upsetting for a white person to casually sport a feathered headdress. They're items of deep symbolic meaning to the people who originated them, bestowed in recognition of great achievements. Treating them as party hats cheapens and dishonours them. But as the appropriation concept has been used to object to many formerly innocuous forms of cultural mixing, certain criticisms of the term become increasingly credible. The more things are stuffed under the cultural appropriation tent, the more legitimate the concern that it may put limits on creativity, cultural exchange, and innovation. To this list of concerns, I would add, remaining forever fearful of cultural appropriation will smother the international socialist project I envision by contributing to what Adolf Reed has disparagingly termed essentialism, the almost metaphysical belief that culture stands apart from politics and economics. Simply put, there is no magical or particular essence that gives people born into a culture the right to deny those who are not from that culture access to art, ideas, music, and the like. We should all be open to all cultures and should in fact embrace and encourage cultural exchange and syncretism. Similarly, when it comes to political strategy, we should draw inspiration from the history of transnational organising, in which people from various cultures work together to overcome some of the 20th century's worst oppressions. Take the history of South Africa's African National Congress, the party of Nelson Mandela. Founded in 1912 as the South African Native National Congress, the ANC helped smash apartheid and, in fact, still governs the country today. The party's history exemplifies some of the absolute best of the international socialist tradition, and tragically also shows how neoliberalism, appealing to narrowly conceived identity politics, and authoritarianism can undermine revolutionary momentum. But I'll get to that part in a moment. First, let's talk about the ANC's incredible synthesis. In 1955, the ANC's Freedom Charter articulated the goals and aspirations of a liberated South Africa in a strikingly international socialist idiom. 1. We, the people of South Africa, declare for all, our country and the world to know, that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white, and that no government can justly claim authority unless it is based on the will of all the people. That our people have been robbed of their birthright to land, liberty and peace by a form of government founded on injustice and inequality. That our country will never be prosperous or free until all our people live in brotherhood, enjoying equal rights and opportunities. That only a democratic state based on the will of all the people can secure to all their birthright without distinction of colour, race, sex or belief. 2. All people shall have equal right to use their own languages and to develop their own folk culture and customs. 3. The national wealth of our country, the heritage of all South Africans, shall be restored to the people. The mineral wealth beneath the soil, the banks and monopoly industry shall be transferred to the ownership of the people as a whole. 4. Restrictions of land ownership on a racial basis shall be ended, and all the land redivided amongst those who work it, to banish famine and land hunger. The state shall help the peasants with implements, seed, tractors and dams to save the soil and assist the tillers. Freedom of movement shall be guaranteed to all who work on the land. The ANC would go on to form its armed wing, the Umkhonto weSizwe, UWS, the Spear of the Nation, in partnership with the South African Communist Party. The UWS's founding was itself internationalist. Members included Mandela as well as Jewish communist revolutionary Ronnie Kasrils, who after apartheid would serve in the cabinets of Mandela and Thabo Mbeki. Indeed, the ANC framed its ferocious opposition to apartheid and white supremacy in terms of a commitment to non-racialism. Over the course of decades of struggle, it held together an incredible international coalition that included educated middle-class black professionals, communists, trade unionists, and democracy campaigners. And the party was aided by people the world over. To the Soviet Union's credit, it backed the ANC, as did Olof Palme's Social Democratic Sweden. Within and across cultures and within and across borders, the ANC built a lasting transnational coalition that helped the party end apartheid in the 1990s. Much of the Freedom Charter was incorporated into the Constitution of Liberated South Africa, making it one of the most genuinely progressive constitutions the world has ever seen. And though Mandela's notion of a rainbow nation might sound like something plucked from the sanitized world of a Disney movie, it has roots in a noble revolutionary tradition to which Mandela stayed true for his life's duration, even as he made uncomfortable compromises to secure South Africa's liberation in a post-Cold War and increasingly neoliberal world order. For instance, Mandela was steadfast in his support for Cuba, remained a ferocious advocate for Palestinian rights, and responded with moral indignation to the US invasion of Iraq. There is a tremendous amount to learn from the history and theory of the ANC. To be sure, the record of the ANC in power doesn't always match the best of its history during the decades of struggle. Simply put, the ANC has been unable to overcome the economic apartheid that continues to limit its and South Africa's prospects. As Ronnie Kasrils, who I had the honour of interviewing several times on TMBS and who is now a dissident, has argued, the ANC achieved political liberation at the expense of the economic liberation promised in the Freedom Charter. The unfulfilled promise of this next phase of liberation has kept the obscene economic inequality that has long characterised South Africa in place. In turn, many of the old structures of racial hierarchy remain, and the country continues to generate political forces that traffic in demagoguery, crony capitalism, and a shallow technocratic liberalism. These problems are hardly unique to South Africa. Much of what has gone wrong there are local manifestations of global trends. What the world needs to counter these forces is a renewed commitment to the kind of international socialist politics embodied in the Freedom Charter. This book has been my contribution to that cause.